Hello again, everyone. In this video, I will be going over the answers for the introductory web quest and reviewing types of pathogens and then introing your immune response. So up here I have the answer key for the introductory web quest. So you should have already done this before you watch this video. Part 1, so the types of classifications of pathogens. 5 types. There's viruses, prions, bacteria, fungi, and parasites. The 2 that are non-living are viruses and prions. The structure of a virus, I'm going to talk more about this here in a second. It's just an inner core of DNA or RNA surrounded by some sort of protein. 2 types of viruses are based on what type of DNA they have, or genetic material, so DNA or RNA. Prion diseases are difficult to treat because it's just a protein, and they're very resistant to heat, so they do not denature. Number 6, why is it inaccurate to say that all bacteria are bad? We also have a lot of good bacteria that live on us and in us. Some common diseases caused by fungal pathogens: yeast infection, ringworm, athlete's foot. And then the 2 types of parasites: ectoparasites, which means they live outside of a host, and endoparasites, which means they live within a host. Okay, and here are the answers to the table that you filled in comparing these types of viruses. So if you want to pause here and check yours. The next question, so influenza A, very similar to coronaviruses. And so essentially, viruses are just a coat of different types of protein with a little bit of genetic material in the middle. The influenza A virus does have a layer of lipids, which is unique. So that isn't necessarily always true, but for most viruses, that is true. Right, and then here are the answers for the lymphatic system diagram. So again, if you want to pause here and check your answers, I'm going to scroll down. And then these last 3 questions, here are the answers to those. Again, if you want to pause and check your answers. All right, I'm going to jump back over to the Google Slides for this unit and talk a little bit more about these types of pathogens. So before we start off, you should know the definition of pathology. It's the study of disease. So a pathologist is someone who studies diseases. This term doesn't just apply to humans, it can apply to any organism, even plants. There are plant or diseases specific to plants. What is a disease? A disease is any sort of abnormal condition that affects the body. So under that definition, it would also include cuts, bruises, along with mental disorders, and then obviously pathogens. So a pathogen is any infectious biological agent. So the types that we're going to talk about: bacteria, fungus, viruses, prions, and parasites. So these 3 types of pathogens, this is very important because this will be on the summative. So pathogens can be obligate, meaning that they must have their host to survive. So if the host dies, the pathogen dies. An example of that is tuberculosis, which is a bacterial infection of the lungs. Opportunistic pathogens will only cause disease in individuals with weakened immune systems. So for example, the flu. And then accidental pathogens, these are unique because they only infect hosts accidentally and actually have mechanisms to avoid transmission. An example of that is meningitis, which is a bacterial infection that spreads to the brain and spinal column. So the first type of pathogen, bacteria, these are single-celled prokaryotic organisms, and they are named based on their shape and their arrangement. So for example, there's 3 types of shapes: broad, which is called bacillus; spheres, which is coccus; and spirals, which is spirillum. Some pictures of those. Types of pathogens, again, so bacteria are also named how they're clustered together. So it can be diplo, staphylo, or strepto. So for example, streptococcus would be a chain of circular shaped bacteria. Here are some just important bacteria you've probably heard of before: Salmonella, MRSA, E. coli. The other type of pathogen, fungi. Fungi usually live on their own, but some can cause infectious diseases. These are called mycoses. Some common fungal diseases: athlete's foot, valley fever, yeast infections, ringworm. Prions, this is the third type of pathogen. These are interesting because these are just proteins. They don't contain any genetic material, and they cause diseases like chronic wasting disorder, bovine spongiform mad cow disease. There is some evidence that possibly prions cause diseases like Alzheimer's. So they're proteins that cause misfoldings in other proteins, and they're impossible to treat. Here are some other examples of pathogens, diseases caused by prions. An interesting one, kuru, which is a disease that you get by eating human flesh that has the prion in the meat. Some other information about prions. So they cause normal versions of proteins to change shape. And as we know, structure function, if you change the structure of something, you're going to change the function. So it loses its function. Parasites, so they're either endo or ecto. Endo meaning they live inside of the host, ecto on the surface. Some examples, the protozoa that cause malaria lives inside of a mosquito. Parasitic worms, hookworms, tapeworms, pinworms, heartworms, those are all endoparasites. Ectoparasites, so these could include ticks, scabies, head and pubic lice, and mosquitoes. And then the last one that we're going to focus on this unit, which is viruses. So these are very simple. Again, it's just a protein coat with some sort of genetic material, either DNA or RNA. Viruses are not considered to be alive because they do not meet all of the characteristics of life. They do not have metabolism. They cannot produce on their own. They don't reproduce without a host cell. They cannot move, which is crazy. It requires some sort of mechanism from their host to move from one place to another. They don't respire. They don't produce carbon dioxide. They do not eat. They don't require energy. And they do not have cell structures. They do not have organelles. It's just, again, protein and genetic material. Okay, so this picture shows some of the viruses that you explored in the introductory web quest. This picture shows a comparison of an animal cell, which is right here. This is a bacterium, and to put this into perspective, this would be a size of a bacteriophage, which is a virus that is specific to bacteria. So viruses are much, much smaller than even our cells. So very, very tiny. All right, so that is the end of the pathogen review. So now I'm going to tell you just the basics of what you need to know to do this immune system exploration for today. So your immune system. So how does your body defend against these potential maladies that are knocking on the door of your innards? So there are two broad categories, innate and then acquired or adaptive. So we're going to focus on the acquired defenses, the adaptive defenses. But I'm going to talk a little bit about innate. So these are mostly barriers to entry. So some sort of physical feature of your body that prevents the pathogens from getting in. So obviously your skin is a barrier that keeps pathogens outside of your body. Your mucous membranes in your mouth and in your nose. Chemical barriers, for example, there's an enzyme called lysozyme in your saliva that digests bacteria. And then your stomach contains hydrochloric acid, which also acts as a barrier for pathogens to keep them out of your digestive system. As I mentioned earlier, you also have resident bacteria. So you have good bacteria. You actually have E. coli that lives in your digestive tract that is very important to digestion. You don't want to mess with your inside biome. So these bacteria occur naturally. They're found in your mouth, your intestines, your nose. They use available nutrients, and they produce waste that kills potential harmful pathogens. Skip through some of these slides. Get to what we need to know. So innate, again, so that's like barriers to defense. We're going to focus on adaptive your immune system. So these include two really important lymphocytes, your B cells and your T cells. So those are the ones that we're going to focus on, your B cells and T cells. Very simply, B cells and T cells. B cells attack pathogens outside of cells. So they attach directly to a pathogen. T cells attack cells that are already infected. So if the cell has the pathogen inside of it, it will attack those cells. And those cells are called macrophages, and they consume the pathogen through a process called phagocytosis. Another quick comparison, B cells and T cells. So B cell receptors bind directly to the antigen, which is a protein on the surface of the pathogen. T cell receptors bind to the antigens present on the surface of the host cells. So again, these are the B cells here. These are the antigens. Here's a pathogen. So the antigen binds directly to the antigen of the pathogen, whereas T cells, they bind to the antigen present on the host cell, so the cell that's infected with the pathogen. And this is a picture, it shows both innate and adaptive immunity. Again, we're going to focus on this process right here. So here's a macrophage, which is again a cell that takes in a pathogen. When it takes in that pathogen, it will take the antigens on the surface of the pathogen and it will present them on the outside of their surface. You'll see that in the activity today. And then the T cells will then attach to that antigen. And then T cells work together with B cells to create antibodies, which are these Y structures right here. So again, antigens are proteins on the surface of cells. Antibodies are these Y-shaped proteins that help out with immunity. And again, you're going to explore that further in the activity today. So again, difference between antigen and antibody. Here's an antigen, these proteins on the surface of the cell. Antibodies are these Y-shaped proteins that B cells produce. Okay, and the last slide here. So another process, this is what we're going to explore today, it's called cell-mediated immune response. So you have a macrophage, which is a type of white blood cell. They take in the infected cell, and sometimes they also just directly take in the pathogen. It breaks down the infected cell, or it breaks down the pathogen in the lysosome, and it takes its antigens and it presents them on the outside of the surface of the macrophage. And then the T cells here will then attach to those antigens and produce a chemical called cytokine. A cytokine is any substance which are secreted by certain cells of the immune system and have an effect on another cell. So this is a very important process. And then this signals mitosis to happen. So these helper T cells produce more of itself to help fight this infection, and then attached to other infected cells, and then kill those dead cells, or kill those infected cells. All right, so that is all we need to know for the activity that you're going to do today. So let me bring this up. Looks like this immune response exploration. So make sure you're reading all of the text. You have a few models to look at. So one model, which is very simple, cell-mediated response with a few prompts. You're going to look at the humoral response with B cells and a few prompts. And then the last process, adaptive immunity, so how B cells and T cells work together to make antibodies and why those antibodies are so important in fighting infection and in fighting pathogens. And then the last model here shows over time the amount of antibodies present in our body, the first encounter of a pathogen, and then when we encounter a pathogen for the second time, and then a few prompts that go along with this. So please make sure you're spending time with these models. If you have any questions or if you're stumped, please let me know, and I will go over these answers with you tomorrow.